I've talked before about the role that the ACLU played in the early development of my legal and political framework, how I saw them defending the free speech rights of even the groups and people with whom they most vehemently agreed. They often did that with great self-sacrifice. There were primarily Jewish leftist lawyers who in the late 1970s defended the neo-Nazi Party's right to march through Skokie, Illinois, even though there was a heavy presence of Holocaust survivors there. They lost a lot of donors. They almost went bankrupt. The organization was almost destroyed. They survived, and they had the conscience, clean conscience, to know that they stood on their principle of defending free speech, not when it's politically easy or advantageous for their political ideology, but free speech as a principle, which is the only way to defend it. I've been quite critical of the ACLU's abandonment of that view, very disappointed because we need an organization like that, but also very gratified that there is an organization that seems to have embraced from its founding, and I think increasingly defended, that very apolitical, non-ideological, principle-based view of free speech, and that's the fire.org, which we've talked about many times before, and we are very delighted to have one of the most important people in that organization, the Executive Vice President, Nico Perino, with us to talk about FIRE's work, but also the various assaults on free speech. Nico, it is great to see you. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Happy to be here, Glenn.
So, for people who aren't so familiar with the identity and mission of FIRE, I think for a lot of people you became known early on as defending, because you were so focused on campus speech, where primarily it was conservative and right-wing students whose free speech was being abridged, and people assumed, oh, this is just a right-wing group carrying on this right-wing narrative about conservative students being targeted, and never really kind of looked at the full picture of what the work that you were actually doing. So could you just talk about how FIRE began, what the kind of motive and purpose of it was, and how it's evolved over the years? Obviously, the sort of synopsis of that.
Yeah, that's a totally incorrect narrative. FIRE, from its founding in 1999, was founded to be a nonpartisan organization. We have two co-founders, Alan Charles Coors, a professor at Penn, conservative, libertarian-leaning, and Harvey Silverglate, a criminal defense attorney based out of Boston, friends with Allen Ginsberg, very much a man of the left. And bringing these two folks together really kind of created the DNA and the identity of the organization, which is a nonpartisan organization. And as you mentioned, for the first 20 some odd years of our history, we're devoted to fighting for civil liberties on college campuses. We're most well known for our defense of free speech, but we also defend due process rights and religious liberty and free press rights. But in 2022, we expanded our mission off campus, seeing a need for a nonpartisan defender of freedom of expression, a defender that isn't going to throat clear or genuflect before other values, before it issues its full-throated free speech defense. And that's what distinguishes us from other groups that do free speech advocacy, is that we don't take positions on the issues and the speech that we defend, right? How could we? We have a staff that includes liberals, progressives, maybe communists, socialists, we're all across the political spectrum. We couldn't come to a consistent position on the issues of the day. For us, if it's protected, we defend it. No throat clearing and no apologies. So that's really what separates us from other groups that are out there.
Yeah, I know even as a First Amendment lawyer, when I was defending the free speech rights of highly unpopular groups or people with, views that, I don't mind admitting I consider rancid now, back then I refused to opine or denounce my views of the ideology in question because it was just completely irrelevant to the question of free speech, and I didn't want to have to jump through a hoop and say I don't agree with this or I do agree with it, because it didn't matter in the slightest, and I wanted to keep the attention on the principle itself and not on the question of whether this view was a good or bad view. I don't want to invite you to speak pejoratively of the ACLU unless you want to, so I'm not asking you to do that. But I do wonder, given the ACLU's long-stated mission that I thought had kind of been fulfilled, which is more or less exactly what you described. They weren't so focused on campus abridgments, but they also did defend the religious liberty rights of students, the free speech rights of students, a lot of Christian groups and Christian students, and their religious liberty. Why did the founders of fire.org think there was a need for a new free speech and civil liberties organization, given the very large presence of the ACLU?
Well, they did see that there was a need to do this free speech work on college campuses, do this due process work on college campuses. So they did see a need, and whether the ACLU could have done more of that work, I'll leave that to the founders to speak to. But there was a need, and just as I said, with our expansion in 2022 off campus, we saw there a need for our particular brand of free speech advocacy. And I will say a lot of the old school civil libertarians from the ACLU are working at FIRE or are FIRE supporters. For example, former ACLU President Nadine Strawson is a senior fellow at FIRE. Ira Glasser was the executive director of the ACLU for 23 years, from 1978 to 2001. He's on our advisory board. David Goldberger, who was the lead attorney in the Skokie case, which I thought I used to be able to just reference without having to explain what that is, but I've been giving some speeches lately and people have no idea what the Skokie case is. This is a case stemming from Skokie, Illinois in 1977, where a group of neo-Nazis wanted to rally in a town of 6,000 Holocaust survivors. And the ACLU came to the defense of those neo-Nazis' rights to rally in a town of Holocaust survivors. And the lead attorney on that case was David Goldberger, a Jewish man. And the executive director of the ACLU for that first year of the case was a man by the name of Aryeh Nair, who was himself a Holocaust survivor. So talk about going out there and making free speech arguments in the most difficult circumstances. Aryeh Nair, a few years later, published a book called Defending My Enemy, which makes the argument for why you should defend the rights of even people you vehemently disagree with and see as a broader threat to society. These are my heroes. I made a documentary about Ira Glasser called...
Yeah, I was about to mention that. I hope people go. Let me just say, that's a documentary that I watched with great interest. Ira Glasser was a hero of mine as well. I think he took over the helm of the ACLU sort of in the wake of the Skokie controversy, which really did weaken the organization, brought it to the brink of bankruptcy. He sort of saved the organization. And to this day, he's a Jewish civil libertarian. He is a vehement defender of what the ACLU did. And I think your documentary, which is called Mighty Ira, that sort of, and we interviewed Ira too at the time of the documentary. I really hope people will go watch that because, as you said, for me, this is almost like assumed way of thinking. It was indoctrinated in me, and I thought all Americans, and increasingly it's becoming almost like an extremist or radical view that you do have to constantly go now and re-explain it because that history has been deleted. So yeah, and I think, so let me ask you about FIRE specifically with regard to that principle that you've just enunciated, because like I said, you can only defend the people's free speech rights whose rights are being abridged. And on campuses, because campuses tend to be more left-wing institutions, over the last, say, 10 to 15 years, that just happens to have been a lot of conservative groups, a lot of conservative speakers. I mean, even when I was in school in the 90s, there was, we didn't call it woke ideology, but we called it political correctness. There's been this trend over many years. And so FIRE did defend a lot of right-wing student groups and right-wing students. And I always, whenever I would promote your work, I would hear leftists come and say, why don't they defend left-wing causes? And where are they on Palestine and Palestinian groups who are being banned? And I was like, they're all over the place, here and here and here. So can you talk about some of that work that you've been doing well before October 7th in terms of not only defending right-wing student groups and right-wing speech, but also Palestinian groups and Palestinian students whose free speech rights have been targeted by campus administrators as well?
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, we don't pick the people we represent or the people we defend. The government picks the people we need to represent or we defend, or these colleges or universities pick the people we need to represent or defend. So it just so happens that on college campuses, the student body and the faculty and the administration are predominantly liberal. And censorship almost always targets the dissenter, right? And so on these college campuses, you're going to have a lot of conservative dissenters who are going to be punished. But it's not universally that way. For example, as you know, I mean, pro-Palestinian advocates on campus for years have been the subject of censorship on campus. And there's been discussion this year about the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act and its adoption of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. That's an issue that we've been seeing percolate in state legislators. States have been adopting this definition, and we've been fighting against for a decade. And now we thankfully have a chorus behind us, but part of me is asking, where have you been all these years when we've been fighting these efforts? And, the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act is a very dangerous piece of legislation. The IHRA definition that it adopts says that there are 11 different ideas or beliefs that could constitute anti-Semitism. And to my knowledge, this is the first time that Congress will pass a law specifying specific ideas or arguments that could constitute unlawful discrimination. And so and some of these arguments are things like denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, or applying double standards to Israel, or
comparing the
Israeli
Israeli government's actions to Nazi Germany, which may be ideas that you think are wrong, bad, whatever, but they're so clearly protected speech, and this legislation is really a full frontal assault by listing specific politically constitutionally protected ideas that now can be deemed illegal in the educational context if people express them. It's really a kind of remarkable thing. Go ahead if you want to just talk about that first.
And I would just say some of the bizarre ways in which this post-October 7th censorship has manifested are shocking even to me. For example, there was a student group at the University of Pennsylvania that wanted to screen a documentary critical of Israel called Israelism. And the university prevented them from doing so on these kind of amorphous security grounds, which are these security justifications we see all the time trotted out by university administrators. There's never any evidence behind them. Often when we do public records requests at public universities, we find that there's no evidence behind them. But the students went and hosted the screening anyway. It's amazing to think on a college campus, you need to engage in an act of civil disobedience to screen a documentary on a hot button political issue. And guess what happened after they screened it? Nothing. A discussion ensued. Exactly the sort of thing you want to have happen on a college campus. And I have to be kind of frank with you as well, Glenn. This has been a difficult year for FIRE, right? You expand off campus, you have people and you take on cases that don't involve conservatives, or you are taking on cases that involve pro-Palestinian activists, and people are like, oh, no, we won't go there. The day after October 7th, I sent an email to our staff and I said, things are going to get hot. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict has always been a source of tension on college campuses. But we have a motto here at FIRE: we'll drive this bus into the wall if it means remaining principled. And remaining principled in this case means we're losing supporters, we're losing funding, but we have to do the work as we see it. And we think that once passions and factions have changed, people will come to appreciate standing on principle, just in the same way that when the ACLU defended the Nazis in Skokie, that was really tough on them in the beginning. But now
they almost went bankrupt because of it. They almost went bankrupt for it. They lost a huge amount of their donors, or a huge amount of their supporters. But I want to delve into some of the specifics, including Governor DeSantis' banning of a pro-Palestinian group throughout the University of Florida system, which we reported at the time FIRE really instantly and quite vehemently denounced, even encouraged administrators to ignore it because of how egregious of an unconstitutional assault it was. But just on this principle that you were just so eloquently and passionately defending, namely that, if you don't stand on it on principle, including in the instances where it may politically alienate a lot of your funders, a lot of your supporters, it really doesn't have much value. Can you just expand on that a little bit for people who I think 30 years ago would have understood it was shorthand, but now it's a much more delicate and controversial proposition that does need exposition, unfortunately?
Yeah, Jon Stewart, the comedian, has a line that if you abandon your principles when they're challenged, they're not principles, they're hobbies, right? And I don't think an effective advocate for free speech is going to be a free speech hobbyist. That means adopting that principle attributed to Voltaire, that I might disagree with what you have to say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. And when you talk to old school civil libertarians like Ira Glasser, like Aryeh Neier, they talk a lot about this idea of neutral principles, that these are principles like free speech that need to be applied to all people. And I was speaking with a man named Norman Siegel, who is executive director of the New York Civil Liberties Union, and he said, if I could get anything tattooed across my chest, it would be the phrase neutral principles. That's just such an eloquent articulation of what it means to be an old school civil libertarian. And he represented the Klan in his practice. And he said he would hear from critics who would say, Norman Siegel, you're a lawyer. And he said, no. I'm a lawyer for the First Amendment, and the First Amendment applies to everyone, including the Ku Klux Klan. And this is something that even congresswomen like Eleanor Holmes Norton, who used to be an attorney for the ACLU, would go out there and defend the right of George Wallace, the segregationist, to speak at Shea Stadium after he was banned. I mean, this is something that used to be doctrine amongst old school liberals, but I think is increasingly and worryingly being abandoned. And FIRE is trying to reinvigorate this stand for neutral principles. But in our increasingly polarized time, you're seeing people abandon principles in favor of political expediency. So, I just urge your listeners, join this free speech movement and stand on principle, especially when the speech at issue is speech that you disagree with.
Oh, trust me, they hear that from me pretty much every week. One of the things that I love so much about your that documentary on Ira Glasser, Mighty Ira, that I actually did not know before was this history in the 1960s where, you have always had this very interesting relationship, interaction between Black civil rights leaders on the one hand and Jewish leaders on the other. It's oftentimes been a great alliance in defense of common principles. There's always been some tension as well. But one of the things I did not know is that there were civil rights leaders, Black civil rights leaders, who were explicitly supportive of the ACLU, defending the rights of the KKK and racists, the free speech rights, on the grounds that, exactly as you said earlier, and I think this is so often misunderstood, is that censorship is not a weapon for protecting the marginalized. Censorship is a tool of the majority to crush dissent. And if you can abridge the free speech rights of neo-Nazis or communists or the KKK, you could very easily then abridge the rights of Jews or of African Americans. And that was really well understood in the 60s. And it's amazing how, especially in left liberal politics, that idea has really been lost. To the point that I want to ask you about this victory that you had, because when I saw this video, and I'm so glad when I heard that you guys intervened immediately, in one way it was kind of shocking to see people who are elected officials who were sworn an oath to the Constitution, who are not young people, they're in their 60s, 70s, who I thought would have been indoctrinated with just kind of a reflex or an instinct of free speech, just so flagrantly and explicitly violate it at a kind of temple of democracy, which is the ability of citizens to come and criticize or petition or lay bare allegations against their government officials. So let's watch the video, because I found it, on the one hand, not surprising, but on the other hand, shocking. So let's take a look at this first.
Be escorted out
You're
of here.
violating my First Amendment rights.
Talking.
I have certain inalienable rights, and they were not only trampled on, but the mayor essentially weaponized the police force to shut me up.
Ms. Massey,
To request.
I've got to interrupt. There are oral communications during the city council meeting may not be used to lodge charges or complaints against any employee of the city. This is your warning.
A warning for what?
A warning for attacking the city attorney personally. This is what you agreed to when you first speaking. This is the form.
It is unconstitutional, Mayor Hall.
Well, it's not unconstitutional.
It is.
Chief, could you have somebody come down here and escort Ms. Massey out of
Really,
this
is that
chamber?
necessary? I'm expressing my first. Do not touch me. Do not put your hands on me.
Come out with me now before you get arrested.
Are you detaining me?
Yes.
Why am I being detained? Under what charges?
So there's a lot going on there. That's the fire video, but it showed it very, very faithfully. And there's so much going on there, including, while it's shocking to hear a mayor of a city specifically say you're banned from coming to public meetings and criticizing or launching allegations against elected officials, I do think it reflects this kind of erosion of the instinct of free speech, this constant normalization of censorship. But on the other hand, it was very inspiring to watch her just stand so firm and so informed about what her rights are. And she was just so offended by the idea that she would be told she can't express that. So what was, obviously I understand what what motivated your involvement, but talk about what you ended up doing and what the outcome was.
Yeah, I mean, a baseline free speech principle is that the government can't engage in viewpoint discrimination. And Rebecca, in this case, went to her city council meeting, criticized the salary of a city employee, and for that faced criminal charges and expulsion from a meeting, right? You can say nice things about city employees, but you can't criticize them, as the city council person was saying there.
I think it was the mayor. I think it was the mayor, actually.
Oh, the mayor. The mayor. It was a flagrant violation of the First Amendment. And I just got word, actually, that it seems like the city has revoked that rule, but our lawsuit is still ongoing. We jumped in and filed a lawsuit as soon as we saw this because it was absolutely absurd. And we have represented other people across the country who have been subject to these rules restricting what can and can't be said during public comment periods of city council meetings. In East Point, Michigan, for example, there were a number of residents who were restricted from criticizing the mayor there. We filed a lawsuit, it settled, and now actually in East Point, Michigan, they have an annual First Amendment Day as part of the settlement, as a way to kind of educate and celebrate the First Amendment that was ignored when the citizens were previously trying to speak out in the forum of democracy. So,
but Nico,
yeah,
I want to ask you this question, not because I'm trying to make a rhetorical point, because I genuinely don't understand and want to see what insight you have into it. Like I said, I understand that if like there's a 19-year-old or 20-year-old who has been steeped in TikTok left-wing culture and arrives at a left-wing academic institution where they're hearing about the evils of free speech, or rather hate speech and the need to have speech codes, maybe there's not like a developed instinct of what America is and what we're told it is, which leads with the idea that we allow for free speech. That's like so fundamental to the American identity. And I was watching that video. I just couldn't believe not only that the mayor was saying you're not allowed to criticize us, that's against the rules, but everyone on that podium who was members of city council, these are elected officials who are mature. It would have been previously unthinkable to me to hear somebody in such an explicit way impose this rule that is so antithetical, not even like a debatable or kind of like limited case, but just so core attack on what we're taught to believe. What do you think? And like I said, it's not even that it was shocking. It's kind of almost normal now. You see this mentality arising in so many places. Why do you think that is?
Well, it's hard to say, and I'm reluctant to say it was better at one time than it was at another, but I think there's just a lack of understanding of what the First Amendment is and what it protects. Like, you got to assume good motives that people I actually believe that what they're doing is constitutional, even if they don't understand the Constitution. But I think we're educating a generation, and maybe the generation that's tasked with educating younger generations, because they don't understand First Amendment principles. These principles aren't being passed around. Alan Charles Coors, FIRE's co-founder, said, "A nation that does not educate in liberty will not long preserve liberty and will not even know what it's lost." And FIRE recently conducted a survey of 59,000 college students, the largest ever survey conducted of college students on free speech issues. And it found that 32% of students said that using violence to stop a campus speech is acceptable to some degree. That's up from 27% last year and 20% 2 years ago. So not only are students not learning the values of the First Amendment, we have adults that aren't teaching it. And as you see in that video with the mayor, clearly not reflecting those values or respecting them.
So one of the things that I really respect that gave me a lot of even more fortified belief in your organization is that not a year after October 7th, but just a couple of months after October 7th, the very popular conservative government, the Republican in Florida, Ron DeSantis, issued the ruling that for me was very similar, this order that was very similar to what we just watched from this mayor in Arizona, quite on that level of how egregious it was, where he just said, Palestinian Students for Justice, and I think one other Palestinian group, is hereby banned from operating anywhere in the Florida system. There was no allegation of criminality in the sense that they were helping terrorist organizations with money raising or funding. It was merely that their speech constituted material support for terrorism. Just their words criticizing Israel advanced the terrorist cause, and therefore they needed to be shut down. No due process, no trial, nothing. And your group, despite, I think, having a fairly substantial base of donors and supporters who identify as conservative and who most definitely are pro-Israel, watched you, as I said, not just criticize Governor DeSantis, but do so in a continuous, sustained, and very aggressive way, to the point where you, as I said, you urged administrators to engage in a sort of form of civil disobedience, saying, we're not going to follow this order. It's so flagrantly constitutional. Why was that case so important to you?
Well, because students are allowed to form associations around shared beliefs. And if the government's going to say that it's material support for terrorism, they need to have some sort of evidence that it's more than just a vocal support for the actions of some terrorist organization, right? Like, there needs to be some there, and the government didn't put any arguments forward to show that there was. And unfortunately, we see previously, supportive of free speech governors, in this case, Governor Ron DeSantis, and in Texas's case, Governor Greg Abbott, totally capitulate surrounding the Israel-Palestinian conflict, right? And in Florida, you have the unilateral ban on Students for Justice in Palestine, which fortunately some administrators did ignore and say, no, we see this would be a violation of the First Amendment. We can't do this. If it's clear that something's a violation of the First Amendment, you get sued for doing it anyway. You risk losing what's called your qualified immunity and can be held personally liable for violating someone's constitutional rights. And in Texas, for example, they adopted that IHRA definition of anti-Semitism into state law. And you actually had at the University of Texas, San Antonio, video of college administrators saying that there are certain words and certain chants that student groups can't use in their protests on campus. Without any context, certain words, certain chants that they can't use in their protests on campus. Unfortunately, there's a lawsuit being filed there that CARE is leading. We really wanted that case. We didn't get it, but CARE is fortunately filing suit, and we're going to be watching that one closely. But you see it as well with the Stop Woke Act that was passed in Florida, where the state legislature there passed a ban on making arguments surrounding race and sex. And it becomes so absurd that you can't even make an argument for affirmative action if you're a faculty member or you're an invited speaker by a faculty member on a public Florida campus. And the state's attorneys in the Florida litigation, which we are suing over, admitted that. You can't, Justice Sotomayor can't go to the University of Florida and read her dissent in the fair admissions case because arguing in favor of affirmative action would violate the plain language of the Stop Woke Act. So what we need is free speech consistency and no double standards. And that's unfortunately in short supply in our state and federal legislatures.
Just a couple more questions while I have you. When I started writing about politics and journalism in 2005, I was doing so from a perspective almost entirely of a civil libertarian, namely concerns about the attacks on civil liberties, not just free speech, but due process in particular as part of the war on terror, the warrant requirement of surveillance as part of the war on terror, but also free speech itself. And I would say most of my audience was composed of leftists, of liberals, and libertarians. No conservatives wanted to hear a critique of George Bush and Dick Cheney's war on terror, and that was what those values were associated with at the time because it was a Republican administration doing it. Fast forward, say, 10 years later, and it's conservatives who are more aggressively waving this banner of free speech. I've had a result, have had a lot of new allies and a lot of new readers, a lot of new viewers who really seem to center this idea of free speech in the wake of things like big tech censorship that has targeted mostly conservative students, academic censorship. And then suddenly on October 7th, everything changed, where not all, but a good number of those conservatives who had been mocking this left-wing discourse about safe spaces on college campuses, about how certain hate speech is too insightful and uncomfortable to allow to be, started adopting and embracing that exact narrative to try and justify the suppression of anti-Israel or pro-Palestinian speech on campus. Maybe it was naive of me, but it actually surprised me just how flagrant and blatant and pervasive that turnaround was from a movement that had planted the free speech banner as their principal cause for 10 years to just flip on a dime. Did that surprise you, or is that something that you sort of expect?
It did surprise me, right? I mean, I'd be curious for your perspective on the college president's testimony in front of Congress last December, right? You recall that Elise Stefanik asked the college presidents whether calls for Jewish genocide would be protected by their student codes of conduct. And immediately preceding that question, she was asking them about phrases and chants like "from the river to the sea," "Palestine will be free," or "Intifada." So the presumption is that those are calls for Jewish genocide. And she asked the college presidents to respond in one word, and the college presidents used a little bit more than one word and said, well, context matters. And that was jarring for some people, but it was actually the right answer if you're adopting First Amendment standards on your college campus. Context always matters when you're talking about unprotected categories of speech. Just think about how an amorphous call for genocide would be wielded against any side's political opponents, right? At the time, the allegation was that Hamas was committing a genocide against Israelis, but now Israelis are accused of committing a genocide against Palestinians. So you can see how that would easily be reversed. You have people who oppose gender-affirming care being accused of committing genocide against transgender kids, or you have pro-lifers who say that abortion is a form of genocide. You have to be careful that the standards that you set for your speech restrictions are narrowly tailored and that they can't be wielded as political weapons to go after your ideological opponents. So I went on Jake Tapper's show to make this argument, and I think it shocked a lot of people because at the time everyone was like, these college presidents' response was so crazy. What are you saying? You can call for genocide? It's like, well, what does genocide mean? And what is the policy that's actually going to be put in place to ban calls for genocide? And it's almost certainly going to be chants like from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, and Intifada, which on their own constitute protected expression. So, I was disappointed with that testimony. Of course, 2 of the 3 presidents later resigned. But I wish I could say I'm surprised. Principled free speech advocates are hard to come by.
Yeah, I mean, of course, context matters in that case. There's a huge difference between publishing an editorial in a local newspaper or in the student newspaper saying, I think Palestinians should be free from the river to the sea, meaning they should be free in Israel, they should be free in the West Bank, they should be free in Gaza, and, banging on the door of every Jewish student you can find and in a very physically threatening way, screaming in their face. Those are very different acts, as well as, walking up and down saying murder all Jews, as opposed to using standard resistance terminology for Palestinians. I think the problem there is that there was a perception that they were not very principled free speech activists until it came to this issue, and I think that was one of the problems. Let me just ask you this one last question. There's always seems to be these new theories to justify attacks on free speech. So, when I was describing earlier what was called the politically correct movement and political correctness on college campuses, principally the focus there was what was called hate speech. And obviously the difficulty is who defines hate speech. All speech can be hateful, but, and that's always the case with censorship, is who gets to define it. Much more recently, I would say since 2016, there's been this effort instead to kind of create this pseudo-scientific justification around censoring what's called disinformation, which of course, again, is purely in the eyes of whoever wields the power to define that. How concerned are you, not so much more along the lines of trying to censor based on hate speech, which is still with us, but even more so this idea that we can censor false ideas once we label it disinformation?
Yeah, there are always trends for censorship, right? In the early part of the 20th century and late part of the 19th century, it was over morality and obscenity, right? You had the Comstock Act. You fast forward, you get to the Red Scare, and it's all over kind of national security concerns and the influence of, foreign malign, groups like the Communist Party. You fast forward, and then you have concerns surrounding decency and indecency on the internet, and then you get the hate speech codes that became popularized on college campus, and now it's mis and disinformation, and which are sort of euphemisms for things that we've always had, right? Lies, untruths, and the First Amendment has never really carved out an exception for lies. Right? You can have fraud in certain contexts, but out and out lies. I mean, you can lie about getting the Medal of Honor. That was a Supreme Court case. The problem with policing misinformation, disinformation to a certain extent, is you got to determine what is mis and disinformation. All we need to do is look back at what we experienced during the pandemic when masks worked and then they didn't work, and then masks didn't work and then they worked and then they didn't work again. The virus leaked from a lab, or maybe it didn't. I don't know. And tech companies policed this speech, and I think it actually created a crisis of trust because some of the things that were policed and censored ended up being true in the long run. So the only way to actually effectively police it, if you're the government, and I don't think there is a way to effectively police it, is to be able to determine what should be censored in the first place, which is essentially, I guess, to set up some sort of ministry of truth to determine what misinformation is. And there's not a person in this world with whom I would entrust the power to determine what is true or what is false, at least within the government, right? And of course, anyone who might occupy that position of power who you do trust is mortal. And so you might get Barack Obama one year, and then you get Donald Trump the next year, right? So who are you going to trust with this power? But it is the tool of the day right now to justify censorship. And of course, just like hate speech, people don't like lies, they don't like untruths. And so they're willing to look to the government for a solution to solve it. But one of the unique characteristics of being a civil libertarian as you think about the second and third order effects and ask yourself, is the solution or perceived solution, is the medicine worse than the disease? And I think giving the government this wide latitude to censor based on misinformation is definitely worse than the disease.
Yeah, the Ministry of Truth with the literal verbatim term that George Orwell used in the book that we all read in high school and in college of 1984, where he warned about tyranny. One of the features of the tyrannical government in that book was a Ministry of Truth that determined truth and therefore banned ideas that were false. And we seem to be copying that and kind of treating it as like a blueprint rather than something we were supposed to be adverse to. Well, Nico, I'm a big supporter of FIRE. I'm so glad you guys exist. I cover your work all the time. I hope people will go to the site and look for ways that they can support it. I think your work is excellent. I really appreciate your taking the time to come on our show and talk about it.
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. Happy to come on anytime.
Absolutely. Thank you, Nico. Have a good evening. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.